It's a great pleasure to welcome all of you on behalf of the International Organization of Employers, the US Council of International Business, and the USCIB Foundation, as well as SHRM, the Society of Human Resource Management, to this webinar on the business agenda for action, the human-centric approach. My name is Matthias Thorns. I'm the Deputy Secretary General of the IOE, and it's a great pleasure to be your Master of Ceremony today in this webinar. 3 housekeeping rules. This session will be recorded. Secondly, we will have live transcript, so you just have to click on it on the right corner if you want to benefit from this feature. And finally, this will benefit, SHRM participants will benefit for the PDC, and the code will be provided at the end of the session. This webinar builds on a webinar which we had 2 months ago at the High-Level Political Forum of the UN, where we focused particularly on sustainable workplaces. At that time, we spoke about just transitions and how to make sure that workers have the skills they need in order to master the digital transitions. We spoke about safe workplaces, and we spoke about women empowerment. In this global town hall meeting, we take it broader. We will speak about resetting the multilateral system. We speak about rethinking education system and how to address the skills gap. And this, of course, is particularly relevant in view that we just had the UN Education Summit. We will speak about what are the lessons learned from the COVID pandemic and how we can better manage health crisis in the future. And we will speak about human rights and the rule of law, and which is particularly relevant in the view of the fact that we have the negotiations on a UN binding treaty on business and human rights taking place in 4 weeks here in Geneva at the Human Rights Council. This is a town hall meeting. We are very short on time, but we really would like your comments, your questions in the chat function. So please don't be shy, just use the chat function, and the moderators of the different panels will do their best to pick up on 1 or 2 of them. And the other panelists might want to address all the questions which are posted in the chat in writing. I also would like at the end to thank USCIB and SHRM for organizing this global town hall together with us. I would like to thank particularly Jen Falcon, who is a master behind everything, to be honest. She's bringing us together. Abby Sapiro, who has been critical and a critical leader in this exercise. At SHRM, I would like to thank Shinai Kirkpatrick, who has been extremely helpful in bringing it all together. And from the IE side, particularly Monique Depierre, who is the master here for the digital means to bring us here all together. So I don't want to waste more time, just to say we really hope for your active engagement. And with that, I directly give over to Emily Dickens. Emily Dickens is the Chief of Staff and Head of Government Affairs at SHRM, and she will give us the keynote on the human-centric approach to the UN Common Agenda. So over to Emily.
Greetings. I'd like to first thank USCIB and IOE for their continued partnership. SHRM, the Society for Human Resource Management, is a proud member of both organizations. Collectively, we represent thousands of global businesses impacting the lives and livelihoods of millions of workers and their families. We're also proud to partner with organizations like the UN and ILO to advance ideas and policies that build a better world of work for all. I'm particularly excited to hear from all of the esteemed speakers, including Gilbert, the ILO Director General-elect. This 77th session of the UN General Assembly comes at a time when the world needs it most. Nearly 1 year ago today, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres issued a report entitled Our Common Agenda. It stated the challenges that we face today can only be addressed by an interconnected response, with reinvigorated multilateralism and the United Nations at the center of those efforts. In the report, Guterres mentions that we truly are at an inflection point in history. I submit to you today that this inflection point touches no other place like it does the workplace, the location where people spend the majority of their time, the mechanism that allows people to take care of themselves and their families, the incubator for innovation that impacts how well we live. The Common Agenda presents an opportunity for organizations to rethink, reconsider, reimagine, and reset their workplace culture. No matter the size, all business leaders around the world are making decisions that will determine whether their organizations will break down or break through. And this work has already started. The ILO has called for a human-centered recovery for the global workforce, one that balances the rights of employers and employees. In the C-suite, the conversation has pivoted from financial capital and the bottom line to human capital and workplace culture as the new currency. Lastly, in 165 countries, SHRM's 300,000 plus HR and business executive members, the experts on the most pressing topics facing today's workers, are shaping a world of work that's unlike anything we could have imagined. This world of work is dependent upon balancing empathy, wooing talent, both to join and stay, and business needs. Looking at the key proposals in the UN Secretary General's Common Agenda, I would like to focus on 3 people-centric proposals vital to global businesses. 1, leave no one behind. 2, place women and girls at the center. And 3, build trust. When I talk about leaving no one behind, organizations must focus on creating cultures that provide the best opportunity for all, so that during the next crisis and the ones after that, no one is left behind. I know that sounds like a catch-all, but you can't keep focusing on just one marginalized group at a time. Workplace leaders must develop cultures that work best for work, workers, and the workplace. They must be transparent about that culture and give people choices up front. Culture is the heartbeat of an organization. It's the social operating system that shapes organizational values, defining how people work and determining their success. At SHRM's annual conference in June, we released the report Strengthening Workplace Culture, a tool for retaining and empowering employees globally. The report explores the impact of workplace culture on the well-being of workers and organizations. SHRM found that 94% of people managers agree that a positive workplace culture creates a resilient team of employees. 89% of workers said their workplace culture has improved or stayed the same since the beginning of the pandemic. This study, conducted in 12 countries, points to culture as being the glue that binds together the workforce and the workplace. I'm heartened by the fact that SHRM research tells us employees are satisfied with their workplace cultures, especially after our experiences these past few years. But these surveys can only capture a moment in time. As leaders, no matter the industry or business size, the workplace cultures we're creating and maintaining should focus on access to decent work and education and lifelong training so that it can withstand continuous transformation and the subsequent impacts on our people. Here are some recommendations no matter your culture. Ensure that your people managers are trained. People managers have the greatest impact on a worker's experience in the workplace. When they're untrained, this leads to toxic workplaces. Promote state and federal policies that allow you flexibility to be more human amid great change. Workplace leaders must use their voice and experience to develop common sense approaches to long-term issues like sick leave and wage inequity. Promote internal policies and procedures that humanize the experience of change, provide resources and benefits that impact most employees, and allow for personalized experiences when necessary to address an unforeseen impact of change. When I talk about placing women and girls at the center, I talk about things like what SHRM is doing currently. We're proud to serve as the co-chair of the B20 Women in Business Action Council. A few weeks ago, the Action Council launched the One Global Women Empowerment Platform. From this digital one-stop shop, any woman from any part of the world can access valuable information on existing capabilities and networks that will help accelerate and scale their empowerment globally. This platform is not only going to leave a lasting legacy on the B20 Indonesian presidency, it's also a game changer, a championing role models to inspire women and girls worldwide. In March 2022, SHRM shared new research, Women in Leadership, Unequal Access on the Journey to the Top. The research shows women become increasingly disillusioned about equal access as they move up the ladder. The data pointed to their being given fewer opportunities for internal openings and to their being out of the conversations and networks that gave them information about those internal job openings. Though this research reflected the needs of one group, the issues impact the entire workforce. Name any issue that we traditionally think only impact women, and then think about it. Parental leave, dependent care, reproductive health care, professional development, mentorship, and sponsorship. If you address these issues, the solutions will benefit everyone in the workplace. And building trust, that third issue that's so important. The ingredients for building trust are aligned with those for building resilient workplaces. These include typical best practices like active listening and transparency. But now more than ever, we must build trust through empathy. Empathy is a muscle we all have, but we need to use it, and we need to strengthen it. It's not a soft skill, it's a business skill. It's what enables people to work cooperatively with others who have very different experiences, preferences, styles, and opinions. It's what allows us to be more human even as we become more digital. The care and compassion shown to our workers will show up to our customers as well as through service and products. At the SHRM 21 Annual Conference, our President and CEO, Johnny C. Taylor Jr. said, "Sometimes these days, it seems as if empathy and compassion are dwindling resources, but they are our best weapon against cynicism and despair. In fact, empathy and compassion are our only truly renewable resources. We must use what we learned and nurture the empathy to create a more just, equitable, and sustainable workplace." As global business leaders, we have an opportunity to turn the challenges of today into opportunities for tomorrow. I challenge each of you to exercise your empathy muscle as we focus on this human-centric agenda. Leave no one behind by developing cultures that work for workers and the workplace, built on foundations of access to decent work and lifelong learning. Focus on the needs of women and girls to address the needs of all, and build trust through empathy. To each of you, our partners, and on behalf of each and every SHRM member across the globe, thank you for this opportunity to address you today.
Thank you so much to Emily Dickens. Unfortunately, we have a problem with, now I can start my video. Excellent. So thank you so much to Emily Dickens for setting the scenes and for these deep insights. We want to directly turn to the first panel. I turn over to Roberto Suarez Santos, who is the IOE Secretary General, to lead us for the first discussion on resetting the multilateral system. Over to you, Roberto.
Thank you, Matthias. I think that it has been an excellent keynote introduction. Basically, one of the areas where we need really to work better is how we strengthen the cooperation between different organizations within the multilateral system, and how we as a private sector engage better and align better with the objectives of the SDGs, and with objectives also that we have set together also already for a long time. It's clear that after the crisis of the pandemic, but also in the very uncertain and difficult situation that we have in face of us due to the war in Ukraine, we need to do things differently. And we need also to engage in a different manner also with the different international organizations. We have the pleasure to have now with us 3 key speakers in a panel that can also help us also to precisely frame different the way we engage. First of all is Gilbert Houngbo, is the ILO DG elect Thank you, Gilbert, for joining us. It's really a pleasure to have you, but also we appreciate that within your very hectic agenda, you managed to join us. You will be starting in ILO very soon. We also have Navid Hanif, development, from DESA. You know, DESA is the development in the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, is the Assistant Secretary General. Thank you very much, Navid. It's always also a pleasure also to have you, and also thank you also for helping us also to coordinate also one of the major groups, the Business and Industry Group. And also, last but not least, we have a good representative of the private sector, is Nicole Scoble-Williams, a partner of Deloitte. She has been also very much engaged on all the area that has to do with future work, which is basically linked to what Emily has just highlighted now. So Gilbert, I have a question for you. You want to launch an initiative, which is, and sorry if I disclosure that, which is a global coalition for social justice. I mean, social justice is not a new concept, but basically it aims to strengthen the multilateralism. How do you want to build that? How do you want us also to work with you on this initiative? And thank you again for that.
Thank you so much, Roberto, and good morning to all of you. Good afternoon for those connecting from Europe or Africa. This is indeed, when we want to talk, Roberto, about resetting the multilateral system, is really timely for us to ensure that multilateralism is back after what we have seen, given the recent crisis starting, be it in Ukraine or COVID, and also position taken by several member states, which has quite frankly contributed to weaken or jeopardize the multilateralism. Beyond the human tragedies implied in those crises have highlighted one thing, is the interlinkages and the dependencies of the economies and societies around the world. And that has shown the vital need for global and concerted action to respond to those crises. So in front of this bleak picture, one is forced to recognize and to admit that the multilateral system is really underperforming. We can really do better, and is failing to provide the concrete responses to many of our world's most pressing challenges. And that growing expectation gap presents an unprecedented risk of the functioning of our common agenda, if I can use the Secretary General's report. So quite frankly, the current geopolitical situation does not make it easier. And to the contrary, it's making it more complex and difficult to find common solutions to global problems. You know, some have even made statements or asserted that maybe we don't even need the multilateralism. And quite frankly, with all due respect, I beg to disagree that absolutely multilateralism is needed, if more than ever. If people, some people that are rejecting multilateralism as such, is because they want a system that works for them, that works and in an inclusive manner, a multilateralism for all, and bringing this solution. Yes, this is why, Roberto, you alluded to it, from an ILO perspective, it seems to me that yes, social justice is not new. ILO was founded on the basis that there's no lasting peace without social justice. But in recent time, we know that we have failed to keep up with the social justice, where in some cases we have gone backward. Social justice is an intrinsic part of the social contract that ought to be to keep together members of that global community in which we are, whether at the local, national, or regional level. If we want to respond to the needs and the aspiration of people around the world, and most particularly the most vulnerable amongst them, social justice has to become one of the cornerstones in the renewed multilateralism that we are calling for. Although the world of work is a fundamental component in the attainment of social justice, this is certainly not the only one. There are also many other preconditions, which include healthcare, education, food, the right to nutritious food, housing, water, sanitation, just to name a few. So this is a job not only for ILO alone, it's a job for all of us that care about our common well-being. So our idea is to have this social justice coalition so that each of us, each stakeholder, be it we in the multilateralism system, be it the private sector, be it the academia, the civil society, etc., should ensure that social justice is prioritized in all national and global policy making, in development cooperation, in financial, trade, and investment agreements. Particularly the private sector as the main creator of decent jobs and wealth. The role that we will expect from the private sector is quite essential. It is only through its active involvement and the development of sustainable enterprises that we will make this goal a reality. So it is my firm intention to enhance ILO's cooperation with the private sector, so that we can untap we can tap on its total and global potential. Ladies and gentlemen, just in closing, just imagine a world where periodically, every 2 years, every 3 years, every 5 years, I don't know, but periodically, each stakeholder can voluntarily account of what it has been doing to bring social justice in a specific area one step further. So I do believe that collectively, if we were to work together, individually and collectively, we can bring both the multilateralism and the social justice to a new height. Thank you so much.
Thank you to you, Gilbert. It's clear for us that you want to strengthen the social justice angle, also linked it with the activities of other international organizations. You refer also to the private sector and how we can engage. Can you tell us for the IOE community, how you see us engaging with you in this initiative? How do you see us also helping also to strengthen this social justice angle? Of course, working with other international organizations. Is there any way, or we need to do a brainstorming among ourselves as to see how we can do things differently? You have any idea?
Yeah, thank you. Clearly, we want to engage through IOE and through IOE, all the national organization and the Chamber of Commerce or the national other employers association. That's why I was very listening carefully to the keynote speaker who touched on several points that by making that link, we can develop together different area. I don't feel that we have to be too much prescriptive, but in each dimension of our daily activity, we do have elements that can help improve the social justice in the world. And this is either directly what we are doing or indirectly sometimes through the foundations that some of the private sector may have contributed to create it. and to advance it, and be it in decent job creation, be it in universal healthcare, be it in access to water, et cetera, I can go on. And that also touches, which is quite important to me, the SMEs, the small businesses, because we have seen during the COVID, the brunt that they have had to face in surviving, and the old entrepreneurs that you see growing up. So all of that, we need to brainstorm, as you said, and we cannot, each of us cannot be involved in everything at the same time. So we need also to strategize and define who is going to do what, and then having, as I mentioned, some kind of a periodic and voluntarily report back on what we are doing.
Well, we are more than willing to engage, but we'll have discussions, that's for sure. Thank you so much again, Gilbert. Thank you also, Navid, for joining us and also for listening. I have a question. It's not exactly the same, but it goes in the same direction because we have the UN Global Common Agenda. The Secretary General launched this initiative to accelerate some of the action to achieve the SDGs after the pandemic and but one of the areas he really stressed was precisely multilateralism. He referred to reinvigorating the multilateralism. How do you see this reinvigoration of multilateralism, and again, how we can engage further also with the UN family on this area as employers? At the end of the day, here we are representing employers and business, but people that are also very much leading with work-related issues.
Thank you so much, Roberto, and thank you for the opportunity to engage in this conversation. I think it's a hard act to follow Emily and now Gilbert. But let me begin by the clear definition of the context we are dealing with. At the beginning of this year, and this is before the war in Ukraine, the Secretary General said we need to reset the multilateral system because the flames of 5-alarm global fire are engulfing this world. What are those 5 alarms? The pandemic, the deadly pandemic, hopefully we're coming out of it. A global financial system unresponsive to the needs of most vulnerable countries. The climate crisis, unregulated cyberspace, and diminished peace and security. So these are the 5 fires that we need to extinguish with new multilateral system. He also acknowledged that the multilateral system that we conceived and worked with since 1945, since the creation of the United Nations, is not fit for the current environment. We need to rethink, revamp, and redesign that system. And our common agenda clearly talks about a UN that is networked, inclusive, and effective. And anything that we create which is meant to bring all stakeholders through this network, not only on implementation, but norm setting, institutional structures that we build, and then, of course, achieving these goals which are captured in the 2030 agenda. And I cannot overemphasize the role of the private sector, because most of the investment for these goals that will be generated at the domestic level, and it's going to come from all sources, public and private, but private sector will have a key role. Private sector brings the energy, dynamism, capacities that governments cannot offer. And I'm not saying they are lacking something. It's the combination of private and public energy that will take us to the implementation of the 2030 agenda, and also dealing with the climate change crisis, and SC is calling it the climate carnage. Let me give you one example where DESA has engaged the private sector in a very meaningful fashion, and doing everything with them not just giving them the agenda to implement. The Secretary General brought together 30 CEOs from all over the world. It's called the Global Investors for Sustainable Development Alliance. They are doing three things with the UN, with us, and then taking those back to their constituencies, to the private sector to advance the implementation. First and foremost, defining what sustainable development investment means. You know, we have too many definitions, too many concepts of ESG. So SDGs are becoming the defining feature of new sustainable development investment. And GISD, which is the business community, is working with the UN in embracing a common definition. Then they are shaping measurement tools, matrices, because we have more than 400 matrices in the world to measure. So business community working with the UN in a new way of multilateral action, coming up with tools to measure progress towards the SDGs and how private sector can contribute. Sector-based and also general matrices. Then, and that's the key where we really want you to engage with us, moving the money where it is needed. Investment should go behind the SDGs in all countries, but especially in countries where it is badly needed. And again, they are developing a blended finance fund, which will be managed by an independent asset manager to provide funding for sustainable infrastructure. A joint effort by the UN and the private sector. So this is one example where I just wanted to demonstrate that networked multilateralism is already in operation, and we are exploring other opportunities also to engage business in our activities. One such platform is the SDG Investment Fair, but I can share the details in the follow-up question. So there is no way, and every speaker has acknowledged the 5 alarms that the SG has mentioned can be addressed without multilateral action. No country, no one has the power to do it alone, but the multilateralism that is embedded in new realities, that's what we are striving to achieve. Back to you, Roberto.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very good example. We are very much also aware of the sustainable finance also initiative, and at some level also we have been able also to engage. Let me also highlight, and perhaps it's an important point, as you properly said, the engagement of the private sector is about sometimes funding. It is also about expertise, and it's also about innovation, and sometimes about policy change, and that's where we can really bring things differently. Sometimes, and we have this experience with the ILO, and Gilbert now will be leading also the ILO, is how we as business, we can help to change policies at local level if we act together. Our members, I mean, if you go to the IOE members, you will see that our members have a very influencing voice also at national level, a very convening capacity, which need to be better exploited when we fight against corruption, when we fight against red tape, when we push for access to finance for climate change anticipation, when we push, and we'll be doing that in COP27 for skills. I mean, the skills agenda for climate change anticipation is not there yet, and we need to do much better. And that's about policy change. And that's where we would like to engage in a much intensive manner with the UN family, because we can really make, and we have very concrete examples in which we have been instrumental to change local policies in a very one of the examples is Qatar. I mean, and that's also with the ILO. The other example is, well, I don't want to quote countries because you always enter into, but that's an area where we could do better, isn't it?
I actually thank you. I had left this for the follow-up conversation, 2 avenues which we have opened, and I couldn't agree more with you. This GIST alliance has developed 8 recommendations for the multilateral development banks, how to crowd in the private investment and expertise and knowledge. So policy shifts, clear recommendations for the MDBs to become relevant to the 21st century challenges. Similarly, they came up with a couple of dozen recommendations on national level actions that governments need to take, both for the domestic private sector and global private sector, to come in with expertise, knowledge, and investment. So GIST has also done work with the UN in advancing clear recommendations. And Roberto, nobody can question the need for creating a policy environment that is conducive for business. And I'm not saying just for multinationals, for your own business, domestic business. And governments again need advice from the private sector in shaping policies which are beneficial for their country's own context, but also effective in attracting investment from all sources. So GIST is also working on the policy environment with very broad network of individuals who have contributed in developing those recommendations. And you're again welcome to join that stream of work also.
That's a good message, and we'll follow that. And by the way, we have now a question, and I'm going to liaise now with Nicole, which is also very pertinent. Also, how from your side, and now I'll give you the role perhaps of more representing the private sector in this conversation, Nicole. And may I just read you, because my German deputy is telling me that we are running out of time, so I'm going to raise you the 2 questions at the same time. One is how multilateralism needs to be strengthened, and the second question, how the private sector can engage better. And there is a question very specific, and sorry if it's a surprise question, but I think it's also important. Is any recommended actionable deliverables the private sector can start working on? And this is a question from Lydia Fox. And thank you for joining.
Thank you so much, Roberto. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, distinguished guests. Such an honor to be here, sharing the virtual stage with Gilbert and Navid. What wonderful insights. And I'll do my best to try to add something more. My role at Deloitte is focused on the future of work, all about making work better for all humans and all humans better at work. Clearly important to that is the imperative to reset the multilateral system, driving that provocation and collective action across governments, civil society and private sector to work together and put humans at the center of global policy debate around future of work. If I reflect back to March 2020, when we were just a few months into the pandemic, Anne-Marie Slaughter, the CEO of New America, said these following words that I think are quite significant. The coronavirus and its economic and social fallout is a time machine to the future. Changes that many of us predicted would happen over decades are instead taking place in the span of weeks. As we reflect on that, and what we have seen, many of those changes that Ms. Slaughter referred to, changes that we have seen the impacts being broad and deep, which have further exacerbated the challenges that the most vulnerable in society were already facing, which I think is what's really central to our conversation here. So if we reflect on some of those, and then I'll come back to kind of tie them into the private sector and business. If we think about the pandemic setting the world back 36 years in achieving gender equality, if we think about the 4 billion people around the world with no social protection, if we think about UN Women telling us that 11 million girls that left school during the pandemic will never return, we think about 8 out of 10 enterprises, being in the informal economy that employs more than 60% of the world's employed population who don't have access to social protection and employment benefits, And then we think about the challenges that extend to the formal economy. Deloitte's recent research showed that 59% of women in the in the formal economy, have experienced harassment or macroaggression at work in the last year. And 93% believe that their employer would take no action if they were to report non-inclusive behaviours. So if we think about those data points that I believe are alarming and highlight that we are in a moment of great choice and consequence, a moment where these challenges that I've referred to, these global challenges that are complex, that are deeply interconnected, require the reset of the multilateral system to create the sense of urgency, to drive the collective action in tackling legal and institutional barriers, and developing policy frameworks within and across multilateral structures to support and enable all women, men, girls, and boys to adapt and thrive throughout the many transitions that they'll navigate during their life. To do that, we need global cooperation across governments, the private sector, civil society, to bring together a coordinated and targeted approach to policies and actions, creating equal access to opportunities for all, bridging the gap between education and employability in decent work. Together, we can transform these challenges of today into tomorrow's opportunities, make work better for all humans better at work, and place humans at the centre to pave the path forward for a future world that is sustainable, equitable, and inclusive. If I then go into what do we need from the private sector, from business, how can they play a role? Businesses have a real capacity to design, invest, and create job opportunities for work that is decent and inclusive. Work that provides a fair and equitable income, with safe working conditions, with the social protections, and with the safeguards to worker rights. Businesses can also invest in and use technology, not to replace jobs and workers, but to create that decent work and enable an inclusive technological transformation for all workers, for workers to thrive in the digital and green economies, where the demand for new skills, upskilling, reskilling will continue to dominate. It is businesses that we need to be supporting workers throughout the multiple transitions across job roles and sectors throughout their working lives, and providing all workers with those opportunities to engage in lifelong learning and help ensure full, productive, and freely chosen employment in that decent work. Of course, I could go on about the social protections and the safe workplaces, but hopefully that offers some insights about that connectivity to the broader challenges, working together, and the role of business.
And take one of the points you raised, which is the digital transformation, how inclusive it can be. And we are going to launch a report with the Sussex University in Britain, precisely on how the digital transformation can help to formalize the economy and informal workers. There are very interesting findings, and that's also led by I would say there's a private sector role here, which can be very instrumental for that. But again, there are many opportunities of cooperating with the multilateral system. I want to thank all of you, Gilbert, Navid, and Nicole, for your great inputs here, but more importantly, for your engagement. I mean, you know that IOE has been engaging intensively in the last years. We are going to do that in a much strengthened manner, because really believe we have to do that as an urgent matter. Again, back to you, Matthias. I think I was just 4 minutes out of our time, but I think we have a fruitful conversation. Thank you so much for all.
Thank you, Roberto, and thank you to all of you for this great panel. And let us directly go to our next conversation, which is about education. And this panel happens directly after the UN Education Summit. So Charles Fadel, you will guide us through the question about how to make sure that workers have the skills they need in order to stay in employment and get into employment. Over to you, Charles.
Thank you, Matthias, and hello, everyone. And I appreciate your being with us in spite of your widely varied time zones. For some of you, it's middle of the night. So let's talk about rethinking education and closing the skills gap. I'm going to start with our colleague Yusak here. Yusak Kristian is Deputy Chair of the Future of Work and Education Task Force B20 Indonesia. He has served as Director of Astra Auto Parts, involved in managing the industrial policy of the Indonesian Automotive Parts and Components Industry Association. He participates as the head of Permanent Committee for Domestic Trade of the Indonesian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Yusak, thanks for being with us. And B20 is about delivering concrete, actionable policy recommendations and on priorities. So the difficult question that we'd love you to discuss is, in many countries, not all, but in many countries, governments do not bring together their education, labor, and industry or commerce ministries to explain to educators what's needed for the workforce. What do you suggest we do to make that requirement, that need, a lot more visible? Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Charles. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. So back to your question. Yeah, this is quite spot on, as we also included this as one of our action policy in B20 Task Force. We are aware how important it is to ensure the linkage between what the education institution is preparing the future workforce with and what will be relevant in the workplace, especially taking into account the numerous emerging new jobs due to digitalization, as well as the energy transition. From this rationale, we want to ensure that the future of work is people-centered, supported by enabling technology, showing how the people are still the core of the future. People-centered technology is key for future work. Thus, for long-term initiative, curriculum must take this as major baseline and design the appropriate program. It is essential for all three parties, education institution, government, and businesses, to collaborate together in crafting and preparing the link and match between the curriculum and skills required on the job or emerging new skills. This can be achieved through how businesses can contribute to building curriculums together with education institutions, or contribute to a more on-the-job experience from practitioners. This is essential since we can say currently the curriculum has a lot of improvement points to be done, especially to embed STEAM, science, tech, engineering, arts, and mathematics, to build a strong foundation for the future workforce. Businesses also play a big role in this, since they will be the one needing the workforce, and we are already aware there is a gap of supply and demand of talents, where the best businesses can also treat non-formal education just as important. Businesses also have the opportunity to contribute through vocational school as a channel to build from ground up to ensure a group ready to work talents. And vocational education is one of the quick wins to achieve the link and match between industry and education institution. However, we need to elevate the image of vocational education from a perceived second option for education to become preferred choice of young generation, with ease of securing jobs as the end in mind. And I think Indonesian government has tapped into this for some time. But still, for high school level education, we need to improve the perception of higher vocational education by providing alumni with the right skill and mindset matched with current industry or business needs. That's my question, Charles. Back to you.
Well, thank you so much, Yusak, and you've paved the way perfectly for Nazreen's intervention at this stage. So Nazreen, Mani, to introduce you. Nazreen is the Executive Director of the Global Apprenticeship Network. She works closely with private sector companies and international development entities, such as the ILO, IOE, and OECD, among others, to drive forward the agenda for agile workforce development. So Nazreen again focuses on solving persistently high youth unemployment. And so do you find that governments understand that some disciplines like technology and engineering have more career potential than other disciplines? And I don't mean this only for higher ed, but also for vocational education. What are your thoughts on that?
Thank you, Charles, and good morning to everyone. Such an important issue, this partnership with governments to ensure that governments actually understand the importance of new and emerging sectors, of new and emerging careers when doing skills planning. And I think that's the disconnect to your point. You know, there's a large body of government partners who perhaps don't understand the value and contribution of dedicated and focused science, technology, engineering, and mathematics support. And I think we've seen it in the work the GAN Global does in our country networks, where we have to engage with country partners, we have to engage with policymakers to make this a very deliberate agenda item. In fact, it has to become a very deliberate policy stream, but the key to it is it needs interconnectedness across government. You know, it's not just the education departments who need to manage this. It's not just the labor department that needs to manage it. It needs the very focused industrialization side of government. It needs the science and engineering, technology arms and branches. Really, we need to break down the silos. And we've seen that where we bring the parties together, where we have the engagement, where we have the link to the private sector, it certainly improves the output. It improves the career guidance counseling. It improves the support to teachers, importantly, because the other issue we forget is it's not just guidance counselors in school who are supporting learners in career choices. It's really teachers. So how do we engage with teachers and educate them? GAN did some very interesting work in Argentina during the pandemic, where we did targeted training for high school teachers on vocational education opportunities, so that when they're giving learners ideas and advice and just insights into what's out there in the world of work, they are also up to date with what is happening in the renewable space, in green technology, in the creative sector, because I think it's something we also forget. The creative sector is very embedded in STEM, graphic design, architecture. There's a whole new body of computer engineering that falls within the creative sector. So all of the young people who want to become video game designers, but right there in that sector. So in short, I think more work needs to be done. I think governments are trying, but certainly it can't be a one-sided policy development angle. It needs public-private cooperation.
Thank you very much, Nazreen, and I'll editorialize for myself by saying we talk a lot about STEM or STEAM, but if you look right down to it, there's no technology and engineering being taught in K-12. You know, very little technology and absolutely no engineering. And so we need to make time and space available for this to happen. It's not going to happen just because we ask, you know, that the kids be interested. We got to get them interested by starting them younger.
Absolutely, and very much having private sector in there, shaping curricula, you know, giving insights into subject design and supporting these transitions between school and work.
Thank you very much. So Paul, turning to you, Paul Coe. Paul Coe is the head of economic graph policy research at LinkedIn. He leads a team of economists and data scientists researching issues on the global workforce in partnership with government and research institutions, using data from LinkedIn's economic graph. Paul, where are you?
I'm right here. Can you see me?
Oh, here we go. Too many icons on my screen. So LinkedIn is the world's largest professional network, and I'd love you to tell us, you know, labor market demand was already changing quickly before the pandemic, right? And the pace of change has only accelerated since that. And so, for example, healthcare has gone remote, retail is going digital. So is that perception of jobs and the skills that are corresponding, is that perception real? Are they really changing that fast?
Well, we saw a remarkable change during the pandemic in terms of what we've observed in the labor market. And thank you, Charles, for the question. I think at LinkedIn, we have a unique perspective on the labor market. Because LinkedIn is a place where employers can post jobs, individuals can post their professional profiles, and we can see what kind of jobs, skills, and employers, individuals are actually going to, skills are demanded by employers from those job postings. We saw some particularly acute trends during the pandemic, and that acceleration, that pace of change really took off during the pandemic too. And what we found is that jobs are changing. And even if you're not changing jobs, and we saw this acceleration during the pandemic, the skill set for jobs changed around 25% since 2015. And by 2027, we expect that number to double. So even being in the same job, not changing jobs, you can see a remarkable amount of change that we're witnessing in the labor force too. And the pandemic really pulled forward some key trends that were already happening before the pandemic began. So digital was already ever present in our lives, and that was a necessity during the pandemic. We saw it appearing in more jobs than ever. Hundreds of new digital tools appeared. Digital skills, digital tools were appearing in more jobs than ever. In 2020 alone, we saw more digital skills being added in the past 2 years combined. So new skills are being demanded not only by employers, but also being updated by individuals and listed as well. And also that interaction, that move to digital, to virtual, online, soft skills and collaboration skills have become also more critical too. We saw increasing emphasis, especially in job postings, on a lot of those skills that enable us to collaborate digitally. So we saw that all coming up. Another trend that was also appearing as well was sustainability, or quote unquote green skills, that were actually bubbling up across many different industries as an emerging need. And we saw this as a particularly sustained trend, and one where we think demand will outstrip supply. So all of this, we found an incredible amount of change, and definitely accelerated during the pandemic.
Thank you very much, Paul. And we really hope that governments will access this sort of data. It's remarkable and fascinating, which always begs the question whether governments can adapt fast enough to these technological changes. Yusak, returning back to you briefly, because we have time constraints. Governments are not spending anywhere near what's required on teacher professional development, and there's no plausible scenario where teachers would be replaced. That makes no sense for all sorts of reasons. So what do you think we could do to break this short-term mindset, of their government's re-election cycles, rather than their longer-term view of teacher professional development over decades, the way it has happened in Singapore or Finland or many successful countries?
Yeah, thank you, Charles. As previously mentioned, we know how work is evolving into a new realm with numerous new jobs that requires new skills, for sure. Solving this comes in two parts. The first one, as mentioned, was to ensure the alignment of the curriculum with the relevant skills, especially in emerging new jobs. And the second part is adequate instructors or teachers. One of the challenges that Indonesia is facing is the lack of skilled and competent instructors or teachers. This is where the collaboration among G20 countries plays an essential role. It would be advisable for the government to implement a development program to skill more teachers or instructors to more advanced countries, so that they are able to improve and implement what they have learned as the best practice. We want to encourage the government to see how important professional development is, in which we have included in our policy action to upgrade teaching techniques to incorporate more experiential, project-based, and team-based approaches, and teach future relevant skills and content, which requires forward-looking and instill a long-term mindset for the future outlook. Well, as business community, we can only contribute by collaborating in three parties initiative mentioned above, especially in providing opportunity for hands-on experience with on-the-job training. All the collaboration must touch not only the students, but also the teachers to ensure that they know what they are talking about and have hands-on experience to teach. Again, all of this can only be achieved with the collaboration of the tripartite. That's the answer.
Thank you very much, Yusak. And Matthias, I have to ask you, since we started late, can we continue pushing the envelope a bit, or
for 2 more minutes?
2 more minutes. So 1 minute for Nazreen to address alternative micro-credentials and their potential.
Charles, that's an important and touchy subject, depending on who you speak to. But I think it's clear that there's a role for micro-credentials. There's a role for stackable qualifications in transitioning people to continuous learning, to lifelong learning. I see Paul nodding his head. We've seen LinkedIn offer such solutions. And I think we need to become quite open to integrating micro-credentials into our qualifications frameworks. Anyone who's interested can have a look at the great work Australia has done. The government has introduced a policy on this. And I think it creates for really meaningful engagement with the skilling system as people learn in smaller chunks, but still giving them recognition towards a whole qualification. And I think that was 30 seconds.
Thank you, Nazreen. That was perfect setup for Paul, learning in small chunks. And the question to you, of course, would be if the jobs and skills are changing so rapidly, learning once and for all in 12 years doesn't seem to make much sense anymore, correct? So you have
yes, I'll echo
60 seconds to treat this important question.
I'll echo a lot of what's been said on this call, and Nazreen mentioned the importance of micro-credentials and lifelong learning as well. And we've seen this on LinkedIn too. It's in our society, education is largely front-loaded. So actually thinking that you're going to be completely equipped with the set of skills that you need for the rest of your career is just impractical as well. You know, new roles are constantly changing, as I mentioned, and being able to adapt, being able to keep up, and also equipping our educators on what skills that, how jobs are changing and what skills are needed for those jobs is increasingly important. But all of that credentials are increasingly common and will become ever more prevalent. LinkedIn alone, you know, I think from August 2020 to August 2022, we saw a 44% increase in the number of individuals adding credentials, micro-credentials on their profile. We saw employers using these signals in terms of how they're hiring, screening candidates too. So you see the shift underway as well to help individuals kind of differentiate themselves, highlight the skills that they have that are relevant for a lot of these positions too. So we see that an increasing common trend that, you know, this lifelong learning and new ways to signal those skills are going to become increasingly important.
Great. Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you, Yusak and Nazreen. It's been comforting to hear that the business sector is stepping in where governments can't or are too slow to do so. So thank you for giving us hope. Matthias, back to you.
Thank you, Charles. And I know the problem is always we don't have enough time for these important topics, but at least I think we got some key important insights and messages from this panel, which we can build on then afterwards. Let us turn to Scott Ratland. Scott Ratland is the ED of Business Partner to Convince, an important initiative which came out of the COVID crisis, and I am very proud to be part of this initiative, Scott. You are focusing in your panel on global responses to future health crisis, so we are better prepared for whatever might come in the future. Scott, over to you. Thank you so much. And before you start, if you have any question in the chat, I would really ask the panelists who are still online to respond to this question. So although we don't have the time necessarily to do it all here live on the screen, nevertheless, we can do it then directly in the chat function. So continue your questions and all the panelists, please respond to them in writing. Thank you.
Great, and thank you, Matthias and IOE and all who put this together in such a great way. As mentioned, I'm Scott Rathson. I'm Executive Director of Business Partners to Convince, BP2C as we call it. It's an initiative of the U.S. Council for International Business Foundation. And we launched this 2 years ago with partners at the UN High-Level Political Forum. And it's really interesting to hear today, of course, that ASG Hanif earlier said the Secretary General has the 5 alarms. And of course, we couldn't hide ourselves of anything that was more important than the first alarm of the COVID crisis. And that's what we really focused on with Business Partners to Convince, with what we believe and still is the way out of this, vaccinations for a healthy planet. We've been working on all that. And let me just say to thank both all the speakers beforehand, the honorable speakers, the distinguished guests here, and Peter Robinson and Abby Shapiro for the great work at USCIB in support of our efforts. Today, we have 2 great speakers. I say that because they're not new to USCIB, nor probably new to many of you who are watching. We have Derek Hines and Victoria Weldon. And just to give a very brief introduction on each, and since Paul just mentioned all the stuff that people have on LinkedIn, all of us have longer bios and information on LinkedIn that you can look at. But we have 2 great speakers. And then I'll be able to come back at the end and mention just some resources that we have at businesspartnerstoconvince.org that also supports the efforts on how we respond to future health crises. So first, I'll just introduce both Derek and Vicky, and then I'll turn it over for some questions. I think we should have a great 15-minute discussion with our panelists. Derek is President and CEO of FETCO, based in Ottawa, Canada. FETCO is an employers association made up of federally regulated employers in Canada, including most major airlines, courier companies, marine ports, railways, and telecom firms. The focus of FETCO's work is on labor, employment, and workplace-related matters at all levels with their member organizations. And again, Dr. Victoria Weldon, she's the Global Medical Director of ExxonMobil, has done great work, not only in supporting with USCIB and sharing challenges and successes in the past on other webinars that we have hosted. And again, thanks to both of them for joining today. So first, I'm going to turn over to Derek and ask, please share, what you've done with your organization that demonstrates the response, of course, to COVID and how you've been able to address these challenges in both your communities, your workplace, your whole network and society. And then we'll have Vicky will follow directly with the same question rather than an organization, of course, on the company.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I'd say sort of a perverse consequence of living through a global pandemic was, particularly in the early days of responding, I don't think I ever felt more valued as a person running an association. Our members were, like all of you on this call today, gripped with trying to deal with this unprecedented crisis. The employers that I represent, were really severely focused on 2 fundamental priorities. One around just basic business continuity, how to keep the business running and keep the doors open. And then, of course, health and safety, occupational health and safety in particular. There was an absolute insatiable need for access to the latest information. I tried as best I could to be a conduit for that. We were clearly all learning as we go. What I tried to do, certainly in the early days, was be a source of communication between major employers and government when government was trying to sort a way through this crisis. Tried to communicate out emerging global trends and learnings to our members. There were others who were learning as we did. I know, Scott, you and I connected very early on in this crisis, and we learned lots from the important work that you and your team were doing. And then finally, I'd say I put a lot of effort around communications between members. So, employers were learning themselves. And there was a real opportunity for best practice sharing between large employers. So I tried to provide an environment for that so that as folks would learn things, they could have an easy access to share it with others. So that was really, from my perspective, what was my focus, particularly in the early days, was to try to be that conduit for information.
Great. And as sort of the implementation science as we're building the plane, as we're flying it or improving it. So we want to make sure, but thank you for those efforts. And Vicky, over to you.
Yeah, hi, hello to everybody. I've really enjoyed the discussion so far. I would just love to talk with all of you. It's amazing to see the effort that's going into being sure that people are at the center of these discussions and our workers who are so important to society. So I'm a little bit uniquely positioned perhaps, and while I could go many directions with this conversation, I want to kind of start with kind of where my perspective and my lens and what I can share with you. I'm a physician, and my responsibility is to promote and to protect the health of our workers. I'm embedded within a major corporation. There are other people like me. The specialty is called occupational health, and we specialize in the health of workers. And so I'm fortunate to work for a company that values that greatly. So I have a team of professionals, and we're a global company. We have a very large reach. So I have professionals throughout the globe helping to manage this health of workers for ExxonMobil. I want to give a shout out to our public health manager, Dr. Malik Diarra, who many of you may also know. He's also on the call and is largely figured into our response. And he really helps cultivate the outreach to many of y'all's organizations and helps us coordinate the sort of public-private partnerships that we value so much. And never has it been more important than it was during these last 2.5 years, where we witnessed the largest public health crisis in a century. So what I would say our main job was and what we experienced, so again, I'm within one corporation, but we are across the globe. Credit to Dr. Diarra's group who let us know from the moment there was maybe about 17 cases of an unusual illness in Wuhan. We began following at that moment, and we have followed and responded to this crisis as it had made its way across the globe and managed it throughout all the different stages simultaneously in many, many countries. And I think the main thing was there was massive amounts of information coming in from the news. So all of our workers were watching news reports and they were trying to process what this all meant. And even in the science came faster than we've ever seen it. And it wasn't always as accurate because we were all trying our best to understand quickly. So creating clarity was one of the most important things. And as Derek said, the need for communication and creating clarity for people in order to be sure we were keeping people safe at work and maintaining business continuity. So we didn't have the luxury of saying everybody just stay home. And while there are industries that can do that, there are many industries that create critical products and infrastructure that require people to be in the workplace. And that's really what we had to manage. And that was it was very dramatic, I would say. But we really valued the relationships that we have built through the years and leveraged the different groups for their expertise. Vaccination was one. We needed to help people create clarity on vaccines and what our position was and how we wanted to inform our workers and have them make informed decisions. So all of these things are valued by us. And I think the biggest lesson is we need to continue to nurture those relationships. Where we can have more coordination globally, I would certainly welcome that because it is challenging to manage a global response when there's not a good degree of coordination. We try to create that coordination within our company, but there's many companies that are smaller and don't have these kind of resources. So I'll stop there. I'm going to hand it back to Scott to carry on.
Great, Vicky. You answered the question in the title. Lessons learned. Of course, we need to nurture the relationships. We need coordination amongst all levels of society and better communication. Both you and Derek have harped on that. And I think what we're seeing more, although the postmortem is not done, and we're not done with COVID, even though some people have called it over, we're continue to highlight those challenges of communication. And what do we do now to get to the final lap or chapter here that we can get back for full business continuity and resilience. So with that, I'll go back over to you, Derek. What do you think the challenge is given where we are with the global system? We've heard this for speakers here thus far. What are the challenges and where ought we focus?
Well, I mean, I think building on the point that Vicky just made around ongoing coordination, that's a critical challenge. And I think it's the momentum we've gained throughout this pandemic around that communication, that coordination. That's a challenge, and I think it's one that we need to rise to. We clearly saw, particularly in the early days of the pandemic, challenges with the global supply chain when we were looking for access to life-saving critical supplies, PPE. That was an obsession of the employers that I represent in the early days. So certainly I think that's one of the challenges as we move forward, is to ensure that that supply chain is robust and ready to respond more quickly if and when something like this happens again. And then when we think about things like just the vaccine rollout, I do think there is a challenge around just some basic fundamentals of truth. We need to ensure that we work together to ensure that information that is shared is rooted in truth, is rooted in scientific fact. And Vicky noted that, we were learning as we go on the science perspective, but the reality is we also were deluged with misinformation and disinformation. So a real challenge there, I think, for the global community is to continue to work together to ensure the information that we share is rooted in fact, is rooted in truth. We need open and ongoing partnerships between all key stakeholders. I was really struck, it sounds hokey, but I was really struck at the beginning of the pandemic that it revealed really how good people are. When we saw the global community come together, certainly within our country, I can speak with experience that we saw politicians, senior officials, business leaders, union leaders, employees, folks really come together and work towards a common good and fighting a common enemy, if you will. There's a lesson learned there. I think the challenge moving forward is to maintain that momentum and to keep those partnerships strong so that we can be better prepared should this ever happen again. And I think the last thing I'd say is that I think one thing we really learned from this and the challenge moving forward is that we need that commitment to consistency in the messaging, consistency in the approach that we take in responding to crisis. On a micro level here within Canada, from a health and safety perspective in the workplace, we have 13 different jurisdictions, 13 provinces and territories plus the federally regulated system, so actually 14. And we have inconsistencies in the way the regulatory approaches work, and that really revealed itself as challenging for employers as they're trying to sort their way through how to respond and how to deal with health and safety matters in the workplace. So that consistency and greater harmonization moving forward would be a real benefit.
Great. And Derek, what you highlighted, both the truth in other areas and the transparency and coordination is the area we've been highlighting of building trust. How do we build trust also and increase the trust that we have with both the private sector and institutions? And people do trust their employer, oftentimes in many countries around the world, more than their government. And they also are looking for their employer to help sort through the maze, as Vicky mentioned, of ExxonMobil and her networks. So Vicky, I'm going to pass the last question to you because we're going to end up with the challenge with time. And it's more than $1 million, it's $1 billion question, right? How can we rebuild our trust in the global system, health authorities, science, and have this active role that we've all fostered? Well, those of us who are participating on the call, both as panelists and participants.
Okay, that is the $1 billion question, and thank you for that. And I don't know if I have a $1 billion answer, but it's a work in progress. How about that? I think that as I think about it, we have a concept in delivering kind of our own services within ExxonMobil to a global, audience of workers. And it's to really take a global approach, have common systems where we can, but always recognize that there is an element of a local solution, particularly in health, because healthcare is local. Health issues, particularly the outbreak. I mean, you saw this in COVID. There were things that were happening that were common across, but when the US, for example, was beginning to really sort of double down and address and understand the situation, China was already wondering, how do we unwind what we started and go back to normal? And you had sort of this sort of up and down all across the globe. So having the right balance, having a body of experts that can address sort of the global aspect while appreciating local differences, I think is where we struggle a little. People felt that they were getting mixed messages when the CDC might say one thing and the World Health Organization might see another. And that does, in a way, make people a little bit cynical and not trustworthy. So finding a balance, and I don't want to be perceived as criticizing any groups. Everybody was doing the best we could in a very, very dramatic, fast moving, difficult situation. But I do think we should take a step back and see, is there a way to do that a little better? News media, one of the things we did that was fundamental to our building of trust, and we did get feedback that the workforce did trust us as a source of information. And when I say us, it's our occupational health department within the company, because we took a motto where we said, all right, all this information's coming at each other. Some of it's from the news, some of it's from science, and let's take an approach where we try to understand what people are saying and what we're hearing, anticipate what that means, and then adapt our response based on that. Some things, came out so that we were sort of trying to be the truth sayers. And I think that we had a systematic way that helped us to do that. It's not easy, but we all need to be able to point to resources that can be trusted. And we certainly were able to find within our own organization, but also externally, there were people who were clear experts. But to be fair, with a new virus, everybody's learning, and I've mentioned that earlier. It's difficult to be the true expert, but there are people who study some of these things and have been through many pandemics or many epidemics and things like that. So I think that that's sort of where I feel like the emphasis should be, is just how to coordinate what's important and allow for the local response.
Great. No, very well said. And I know we could go on, and this has just been an amazing discussion. And thank you both for focusing on the important areas. Let me mention, hidden behind the icon there, the USCIB Foundation Business Partners to Convince icon, is Jen Falcon, who's helped develop all these resources, notwithstanding the great work for this meeting here. But this is dynamic, and we are adapting, and we're all working together. And there's some opportunities that we'll also put in the chat as we work with IOE, SHRM, and the other partners that have been part of this. And I see Matthias is back up, and want to appreciate turning it back over to you and the time we've had today. And we look forward to the human-centric approach and working with all of you again in the future. So thank you.
Thank you, Scott and Derek and Victoria. And the last question about trust is directly linked to our last panel, which is about rule of governance, rule of law, when it is about reinforcing human rights. Before we start with the panel, we will be addressed by the chair, the president of the UN Human Rights Council. I'm very proud to have with us the ambassador, Federico Villegas. He will address us in setting the scene for this important topic.
Dear participants, I'm pleased to be part of this panel discussion on reinforcing human rights, the role of governance and the rule of law in the frame of UNGA77 Global Business Town Hall. The Human Rights Council has long had a key role to play in the business and human rights agenda. The mandate of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Business and Human Rights, 2005 to 2011, which led to the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, was driven by the Human Rights Council and the Commission before it. As a framework based upon states' existing international human rights law obligations, the UNGPs, and in particular its pillars 1 and 3, require good governance and the rule of law to be effective. These pillars are clear. The state has the duty to protect people against human rights abuse by business enterprises. This means the obligation to prevent, investigate, punish, and redress such abuse through effective policies, legislation, regulations, and adjudication, all of which rely upon the rule of law. In addition, states have to ensure through judicial, administrative, legislative, or other appropriate means that when human rights abuses occur within their territory and jurisdiction, those affected have access to effective remedy. Remedy is essential, and that is the reason why the Human Rights Council supports the OHCHR's Accountability and Remedy Project. This project has produced recommendations in order to achieve more effective forms of remedial mechanisms, state-based and non-state-based, in business and human rights cases. In order to have effective remedies, we need to have and enforce robust legal regimes relating to business activities and human rights, including their employees. There is also a key role for governance and the rule of law beyond individual jurisdictions. The business and human rights agenda is a key element to address global issues and requires a global response. It is a process with multilateral approaches. For example, since 2014, we have at the HRC an open-ended intergovernmental working group on transnational corporations and other business enterprises with respect to human rights to elaborate an international legally binding instrument to regulate in international human rights law the activities of transnational corporations and other business enterprises. In parallel, the UNGPs have, since their adoption, been increasingly diffused into policy frameworks, laws, and regulations across the globe. And the Universal Periodic Review and the recommendations that arise from it have had a relevant role in that regard, giving rise to successful stories on the ground, including when it comes to their impact on employees. Finally, in relation to Pillar 2, and the specific role of business, this process requires a cultural change. We started addressing the negative impact of business in human rights with the concept of corporate social responsibility. And we made a shift to the concept of corporate responsibility. Now we need to move to the next step, that all business, small, medium, large, and international enterprises have the ownership of the human rights agenda because it is a smart business decision to invest in human rights. It has to be a collective effort if we want to succeed. I hope that today's discussion serves as a platform for reflecting on more concrete steps towards achieving good governance and rule of law and continuing strengthening the promotion and protection of human rights as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you to the Ambassador Federico Villegas, the President of the UN Human Rights Council. I turn to Ronnie Goldberg, which most of you know. She is the Senior Counsel for USCIB. And before, Ronnie, you start the panel on good governance, really the chat function is very active. I see many people commenting and re-commenting, so keep doing that. We're really looking forward for this also parallel conversation in the chat function. Over to you, Ronnie.
Thank you, Matthias, and greetings to everybody in every time zone. Ambassador Villegas, I think, has beautifully set us up for our discussion on the rule of law. Let me just remind everyone of the overarching theme of this webinar, which is Secretary General Guterres's common agenda. And to the extent that that common agenda is built on building trust, a theme we've heard in every single panel, abiding by international law and ensuring justice, and indeed social justice, leaving no one behind, is also a theme we've heard repeatedly today. It's really clear that the common agenda and its 12 commitments are based extensively on rule of law. Without rule of law, we don't have transparency, predictability, fairness, equity, accountability, and so on. And specifically to business, without rule of law, we don't have really the ability or the willingness to mobilize the resources from the private sector that are essential to fulfilling the common agenda and indeed the SDGs. So we're very fortunate to have with us today two distinguished panelists who are going to help us unpack the rule of law issue and illuminate business's role in this area. We have with us Teresa Jennings, who is the head of rule of law development for the RELX Corporation, and Raymond Robertson, who is the director of the Mossbacher Institute for Trade, Economics, and Public Policy at Texas A&M University. Terry, let's start with you. Unpack this concept of rule of law for us. What does it mean to RELX, and how does it fit into your business, and why is it important to your company?
I'd be happy to answer that, Ronnie, and thank you very much for inviting me today. Just very quickly, LexisNexis, where I sit day to day, is a division of the RELX Group, which has taken on our rule of law mission. But our CEO about 10 years ago, Mike Walsh of LexisNexis, charged my boss, the general counsel of LexisNexis, to look at how we were giving back as employees. And he found that people were doing odds and ends around the company, which were great. But what they wanted to do was capture all of those efforts under one umbrella. And what Ian found was that the then 4 billion people outside of the umbrella protections of the rule of law, now, unfortunately, it's gone in the wrong direction. There are 5.2 billion people outside of those umbrella protections, were ones that we could really make a difference on. My boss looked at the definitions of rule of law from around the world, including the UN, and he found common elements that he brought together to form our core mission and vision that is our corporate mission. And those elements are, first, transparency of the law. Is it written down? Can you see the law that you're said to have broken? Next, access to legal remedy. Can you get a lawyer? Can you get a fair trial? Third, equal treatment under the law. If the law applies to me and you, Ronnie, is it going to treat one of us differently because of our race, our gender, our religion, or something we cannot or do not choose to change? And finally, is the law being interpreted by the law at hand, or is something external to the law changing that outcome? And it could be as small as court delays or as large as corruption and bribery. When all of these are in place, by the way, that's a thin definition. We do not have human rights specifically in there, but we believe that human rights are included when you do these 4 elements. When you're building your state on that platform and the rule of law is strong, it will last. When you have missing or cracked pieces of the rule of law, everything else you're trying to do will not work. And we find, in fact, that it's not only the right thing to do, but it is good for business. So the Great Resignation is real. Our employees care deeply about our rule of law mission, and it is one of the defining factors why they love our company and love what we do around the world. So Ronnie, with that, let me turn it back to you.
Thanks, Teresa. The conditions that you've described are essential, we believe, to a prosperous and stable society, which brings economics into the picture, I think. Raymond, a big focus of your work at Mosbacher is economics. What's the relationship, as you see it, between economics and the rule of law, and how does economics play into studying the rule of law?
Yeah, thank you very much, Ronnie. And I also want to thank the rest of the participants for such a stimulating discussion this morning. This is super important work. But thank you for that question, Ronnie. I think one of the things that as an economist we've learned is there's an incredibly strong relationship between rule of law and economic growth at the macro level. So having a stable, pervasive rule of law attracts investment, and it also promotes economic growth. It allows businesses to thrive at the macro level, which creates jobs and then creates further wealth and prosperity. Even at the micro level, though, I'd also like to point out that the rule of law plays a very important role for firms, especially in developing countries. Having an effective establishment of the rule of law within firms really helps establish better working conditions and increased transparency, and allows firms actually, based on the research that I have done, does, as Terry pointed out, does improve the performance of these factories. So factories that are able to invest in human rights and promote positive working conditions turn out to be more likely to survive. They're less likely to close down. And we also see them more likely to grow and have those connections with the rest of the world, like through exports and international trade. So both at the macro level and the micro level, the rule of law is absolutely critical for economic growth.
Let's dig down a little bit into that. What data do we have that supports these assertions or contentions that we're making about the importance of the rule of law and the economics of it? Terry, let me start with you, because I know that RELX maintains numerous very vibrant databases. Could you tell us a little bit about what data you have and you collect?
I'd be happy to. So once we came up with our rule of law mission, we started looking around the universe of what was being measured on the rule of law. And we found certain really great data. For example, the World Bank, the World Justice Project, Transparency International. We combined these with our own data and came up with the LexisNexis Rule of Law Index, which showed that when the rule of law is strong, certain other socioeconomic factors like GDP rises, life expectancy goes up, child mortality decreases. We have taken that to an even further level and set up a LexisNexis Rule of Law Monitor, where we can actually do live feed examples of how citizens rate their current status of justice in countries around the world. So there are other databases across our RELX organization. Our RELX group have come up with a database on the SDGs with free for anyone in the world news articles and standards of how all of the SDGs are playing out. And we find that the rule of law, which is specifically mentioned in SDG 16, is an underpinning of all the other SDGs. How are you going to meet zero poverty if there's inequity in justice? How are women and girls going to be treated equally if they're not being treated equally in a system of justice or in access to justice? So this is a patina that we see, and there are many more, but Raymond, I want to see if you have some data that you want to bring up.
Oh, you've done my job, Raymond.
Oh,
No, thank you. Have these data sets or databases informed your own research and those of your colleagues in academia? How do they help in framing any recommendations you or we might want to make to policymakers?
Yeah, that's great. We have been at the Mosbacher Institute, we're ready to release a new white paper that talks about the relationship between the rule of law and the effectiveness of governance. on closing the gap between labor law and labor practice. And this government capacity plays a very important role. That's one of the lessons that comes from some of those databases that Terry just mentioned. And we've also been working with micro level data from factories in developing countries that also illustrate the importance of rule of law for labor compliance with national law and compliance with international labor standards. And it is from those databases as well that generate these conclusions about the importance and value of rule of law for business. If you look at compliance at the factory level using these databases, we see that firms that are more compliant are more likely to grow, and they're more likely to survive the difficult environment that is in the international market. So these recommendations obviously speak for themselves, right? It's really the idea of promoting the rule of law, especially in developing countries, is really, really critical. And as the topic of today's discussion, fostering multilateral cooperation through these multilateral institutions is really a key way to promote that, as well as trade agreements, right? We've also seen that trade agreements are another great way to incentivize governments to really focus on and improve the rule of law.
Thank you. Well, Matthias's face has not yet appeared on my screen, so I'm going to take the liberty. Oh, there he is. Okay, we have time, I think, for one last word from each of you. And so let me ask each of you, and I'm going to start with Raymond. The common agenda is just that. Everybody has a role. And we've now talked about the role of business predominantly. But Raymond, what would you like the policymakers, the governments and UN officials listening, hopefully, to this webinar to take away from this particular discussion on rule of law? And then Terry, I'll ask you the same question, but what do we want our companies to take away?
Great, thank you very much for the question, Ronnie, and we'll try and be brief. I think one of the main lessons is that we want to make sure that as many workers are protected as possible. We want to have as widespread of an impact, especially in developing countries. Rule of law, especially through national governance, is the best way to achieve that goal. It's absolutely critical. And by fostering government capacity and promoting the rule of law, we can reach the widest number of people and improve living standards in the broadest way possible. And that's a really critical lesson I'd like to leave with you.
Thank you. Terry?
Earlier in our panel discussion, DESA talked about financial commitment of businesses, and that's immensely important. And then Roberto countered with, there's a need for businesses to also help establish new policies and look at their own ways of doing things and bring that to the table. I'd encourage businesses to do that. It shouldn't be one company or one person on a mountaintop alone. We should all be climbing these mountains at whatever level and series we're ready for. We have found that with our 10,000 employees across LexisNexis and our 30,000 employees across RELX, each of us have 2 days a year to give back. Tomorrow, I will be giving back all day to work on a project for Sierra Leone to give them justice. Right now, they do not have digital access to their own laws, and we will hand it back to them through the use of about a dozen volunteers working on a project. Think of how your business is structured. You don't have to do what I'm doing, but there are ways for you to do that. The one thing I would say based on another panel is that we as business have to be worthy. We have to make sure that we're in compliance with the laws ourselves, or we'll get that old finger waggling that we don't want businesses at the table. We never want to take that step backward. Our employees need this. It is important for our future of government and everything else. It is not the West telling the rest. We are all in this together, and we have a responsibility to do so. Thank you, Ronnie.
I can't think of better words or a better message to end this panel and indeed this program with. So thank you so much to you both for really an excellent presentations. And Matthias, back to you.
Thank you, Ronnie. Thank you both. And actually, thank you to all the participants in the different panels and to everyone who joined us online and who was so active in the chat. This was really an awesome global town hall meeting. And I directly turn over to Peter Robinson, who is the president and CEO of USCIB. Over to you, Peter, to close the meeting.
Matthias, I agree with you. It's been awesome. It's really been a fantastic, extraordinary global town hall with so many visionary perspectives. It's the second in a series co-hosted by USCIB, IOE, and SHRM. I'm Peter Robinson, President and CEO of USCIB. And for those of you who may not be as familiar with USCIB, we are a business association advocating globally for inclusive multilateralism, where business is a full partner in helping to find solutions to the most pressing challenges facing society now and in the future, as we've discussed today. And we also serve as the US member affiliate of the three organizations that are above my right shoulder, the International Organization of Employers, IOE, with whom we cooperated on this one, the International Chamber of Commerce, ICC, and Business at OECD. So just kind of circling back, today's dialogue focused on four of the most pressing challenges facing the global community for the next quarter of a century: resetting the multilateral system, rethinking education and closing the skills gap, reforming global response to future health crises and lessons learned, and reinforcing human rights, the role of governance, and the rule of law. So what is required to respond? Today, we focused on the role of business and the impact on employees. And I'd circle back to our keynote speaker, Emily Dickens, a member of our board of directors, who said the world is facing an inflection point in history, and spoke about how the vision of the UN Secretary General's Our Common Agenda can only be achieved by balancing the needs of all. She focused on a human-centric approach, empathy, and balance as business looks to build a resilient workplace, one that can turn challenges into opportunities. She gave us a path to achieve it and a clear call to action. One, leave no one behind, as we've heard a number of times throughout the session. Two, place women and girls in the center. And three, build trust, which is just so important for all of us to succeed together. So thank you, Emily, for your message today. You inspired us to reimagine the world of work. And let me thank all our panelists and moderators for your time and your wisdom. We're grateful for the insights that helped us begin to unpack the challenges of today and look ahead to a world of opportunities. The themes that emerged include reinforcing the need for inclusive, networked, and effective multilateralism to respond to today's most pressing issues. And together, we really have the capacity to make the significant changes required to respond to global challenges. To our partners, Matthias, your organization, IOE, and SHRM, who have worked together seamlessly to bring this global town hall during the 77th UN General Assembly, my colleagues join me in thanking you deeply. Given the response and interest from our participants, we plan on putting our heads together on a third in our series of global town halls to keep the dialogue going in focusing on the UN Common Agenda and the role for business and inclusive multilateralism. Any one of the panels today would benefit from much deeper dives into the issues building on what we've been probing today. So in closing, there's an African proverb: if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. We look forward to going far with all of you together. Thanks to all, and have a great rest of the day. And Matthias, back to you. Thanks for your role today in moderating the session.
No, thank you to you, Peter, and thanks to everyone. Have a great day. Stay safe. Bye.
Bye-bye.